By the last week of May, in the spring of 1884, Ada Vane had $13, a scruff of a dog named Pip, and a garden the whole of the Fruit Valley had already decided was worthless. She was 46 years old that spring, gray coming in at her temples and pinned back hard under a faded kerchief, her hands thick-knuckled and stained green at the creases from a season of pulling weeds off a wall nobody thought worth the pulling. She wore a heavy wool shawl of an evening, even into the warm month, a canvas work apron gone soft with age, and fingerless mitts she had knit herself so she could feed a fire without scorching her sleeve. When her neighbors drove past her place of a cool evening that spring and saw her crouched at the foot of that long brick wall, lighting little fires in the row of rusted iron doors set into its base, feeding split kindling to bricks and dirt, while every sensible soul in the valley was in at supper, they laughed. They said the grieving widow had gone soft, that she was warming a wall as other women warmed a cradle, that grief had turned her head clean around. What none of them saw, what her husband had paced out and taught her the last spring he was alive, was why she really lit those fires at dusk, and why the brick stayed warm to her palm long after the last coal had died, and what he had sealed inside that wall, in a chamber she did not yet know was there, would make this whole valley remember a quiet gardener they had buried without a second thought. Before we go on, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. Thomas Vane had died the spring before, of a fever that settled in his chest and would not be coaxed out of it, coughing into a folded cloth until the coughing stopped, and the silence in the little house after was the loudest thing Ada had ever heard. He had been an English-trained gardener, brought up in the walled kitchen gardens of a great house across the water, and had come out west with a head full of a craft nobody in the valley had asked for, and a plan that had been, at bottom, the two of them against the frost. Now it was one of them. The good bottom land, the deep black truck ground down along the creek that could grow anything a body put in it, was mortgaged past what it would ever fetch and gone to his creditors inside a month of the burial. What was left, the one thing no lender wanted and no buyer would touch, was the failed market garden at the edge of town, out where the land went thin and gravelly below the rise, an acre of weeds, a rotting glass house with half its panes gone, and a long, strange brick wall studded along its base with little rusted iron doors that led, so far as anyone could see, nowhere at all. The assessor had come out and walked it and written it down at the price of the salvaged brick, and nothing at all for the rest. And the town had called it, for years before Thomas ever died, the widow's folly. She had no one out there to lean on. Her people were back east and might as well have been on the moon for all the good they could do her. The nearest woman who would give her the time of day was Hetty Marsh, a mile off toward town, and Hetty had her own orchard and her own troubles. Thomas's brother, Silas Vane, ran the brickyard in town, and had never once thought much of the failed garden or the odd man who had married into gardening instead of into money. Ada had a stove, a bed, a dog, and $13 in a chipped cup on the shelf. And when the wind came down cool off the rise at night, she lay awake and did the arithmetic of it, and understood in a plain, frightening way that $13 was barely a spring, and that a woman alone did not last long on gravel ground the whole valley had written off. Silas came out to see her the third week of April in his good coat, with his hat in his hands and his jaw already set. He stood at her gate and told her she could not make a go of the folly, that everybody knew it, that Thomas himself never had. He had a use for the place, he said, or rather for the wall. There was good hard brick in that wall, thousands of it, and his yard would pay her a fair price to pull it down and cart it off, and she could take that money and the sale of the bottom claim what little remained and go back east where a widow had people to see to her. It came out as kindness. It was arithmetic underneath, and Ada knew the difference. She heard him out to the end, standing at her own gate, with Pip pressed warm against her leg. "It's no place for you, Ada," he told her, plain. "Let me have the wall for the brick, and you'll have something to start over on." She looked a long moment at the wall behind her, ivy-patched and weathered and studded with its rusted little doors. "I thank you for the trouble of coming," she said. "But this ground is mine, and the wall stays where Thomas built it." She did not take his hand. When he had gone, she stood in the gate a while longer, and then she went to the shed for the sickle and the hoe, because the last frost had not yet let go of the valley, and there was a thing Thomas had made her promise to do before the blossoms set. All through the last mild spring of his life, Thomas had walked her out along that wall of an evening, and he had shown her a thing his own masters had done in the great gardens of the old country, a craft older than either of them and mostly forgotten on this side of the water. "You clear the wall first," he told her, running his flat hand along the warm brick as if he were gentling a horse. "You keep the face of it clean and the ivy trimmed back off the fruit, and you lay your glass frames along its base, and you pack them deep with fresh manure, good and green. The greener the better, for it will heat as it rots, and it will heat all spring. And then of an evening, when the air goes still and clear and cold as it does before a killing frost, you light your little fires in the doors at the base." He had crouched and swung one of the rusted iron doors open on its hinge to show her the black mouth behind it. "The fire does not warm the room, Ada, there is no room. The fire's breath runs up inside the brick, all through it, the whole run of it, in the flues my masters laid, and the wall drinks the heat and holds it, as a hearthstone holds it, and all the cold night long it breathes that warmth back over the trees." He had made her light one herself that last spring, made her feel the far end of the wall go warm under her palm a full hour after, so her hands would learn the sense of it. She had thought it a queer chore to teach a body in the good weather, with the sun on them and the fever not yet come. "It's a strange thing to fuss over in April," she had said, and he had only smiled at her, tired even then. "You'll know the sense of it the night you need it," he told her, and not a day before. So she cleared the wall. She pulled the weeds off its face and trimmed the ivy back and uncovered, rung by rung, the old espaliered fruit trees fanned flat against the brick, their branches trained out sideways along wires until each tree stood spread like a hand pressed to the warm masonry. She rebedded the run of sunken glass frames along its base, hauled in fresh horse manure by the barrow load, green and steaming, packed the beds deep to his old measure, and set the cracked panes back true, and puttied them. It was slow, filthy, back-breaking work for one woman and a stiff old dog, and more than once she stood out there with a barrow of muck and cried, not from grief exactly, but from the sheer aloneness of the labor, the plain fact that there was no second pair of hands and never would be again. But she did it. And every cool, clear evening after, when the air went still as he had taught her to watch for, she went along the base of that wall and lit a small fire in each of the little iron doors, and fed them careful with split kindling, exactly as he had taught, at dusk, for reasons she did not fully understand yet. That was when the valley decided she had lost her wits. Hetty Marsh came by and stood at the gate and watched her light the little doors and went quiet and gentle, as folks get with someone they have decided is not well. The Kessler boys rode past on their way to town and hollered something and laughed, and one of them called it warming the bricks, for the dead man to come home to, and the name went around, cruel as such things are, the widow who lights fires in her garden. It went round the church steps and the mercantile and the brick yard, and Silas heard it and set his jaw, because a sister-in-law folks thought Mad was a harder thing to price off her land than a stubborn one. The Reverend Amos Cobb drove out one Sunday and sat with her a while and talked gently about grief, about how a body sometimes did peculiar things in the first year of a loss, and asked, ever so careful, whether she might not be more comfortable in town among people. Ada poured him coffee and let him say his piece and thanked him kindly and told him she was comfortable enough where she was. And when he had gone, she looked at her wall in the low red light, at the little fires guttering in their iron doors, and for one bad hour she wondered whether they were right, whether she was lighting fires in a heap of dead brick, for no better reason than that a dead man had once told her to, and whether stubbornness and grief together had walked her out here to make a fool of herself where the whole valley could watch. Stay with me here, because the next thing she noticed is the thing that turned it. And if you are finding some quiet in this story tonight, take a second to subscribe so the next one finds you too. It was a morning near the end of April that first made her wonder. There had been a hard, clear night, the kind that silvers the grass and pinches the early blossom brown across the low ground, and she had lit her fires the evening before out of stubbornness more than faith, and let them die down to nothing by full dark. She went out at dawn with her shawl pulled close, expecting to find it cold as a gravestone, as brick goes by morning, and she put her bare palm flat against the south face of it, low down near one of the iron doors. It was warm, not the fierce heat of a fire, for the fire had been out these 6 hours, but a low, steady blood warmth held deep in the brick, warm as a loaf an hour out of the oven. She stood there in the gray light with her hand pressed to the wall and felt the warmth of a fire that had gone out before midnight still breathing out of the masonry at dawn, and she did not yet understand it, but she felt the first crack run through the notion that she had gone mad. The wall was doing something. The wall was keeping. She began to watch it after that, close as you watch a thing that has surprised you once. She took to setting her hand against the brick at all hours, and she learned its habits as she had once learned Thomas's. Cold mornings the wall was warm on the fire nights and cold on the nights she let it be. And there was no other difference between those mornings but the fires she had set in the doors. So one gray afternoon, curious past caring how she looked, she got down on her knees at the base of the wall and swung one of the rusted iron doors wide open on its hinge and reached her arm into the black behind it, expecting soot and a dead end. Her fingers found no back wall. They found a channel, a narrow smoke throat of laid brick running away sideways into the dark inside the wall, and when she fetched a lamp and held it to the mouth of the door she could see it plain, a flue built into the very body of the masonry, running off level to left and right and vanishing away into the brick. She went along the base then, door by door, and each opened onto its own black throat, and she understood, kneeling in the cold dirt with the lamp in her hand, that the wall was hollow. It was threaded through its whole length with these channels, so that the breath of a fire lit at one door would run the brick and warm all of it, every course, from the ground to the vents she now saw for the first time smoking faintly along its top. The doors did not lead nowhere. They led everywhere inside the wall. She sat back on her heels and let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. And Pip came and put his nose to the open iron door and sneezed at the old soot, and she laughed once, sharp and surprised, out there alone on her gravel acre. It was not a Folly. It was a machine, a quiet, patient machine of brick and fire that her husband had cleared and mended and taught her to feed without ever once telling her plainly what it was, and she understood now why he had smiled at her in the good weather and promised she would grasp its purpose the night she needed it. But knowing the wall held heat still did not tell her what the heat was for. Not yet. And she banked that question in her chest and went back to the work. Because the frost was not done with the valley, and neither, she was beginning to think, was Thomas. The trees told her next. Along the warm south face, fanned flat against the brick on their old wires, the espaliered fruit trees that she had uncovered from the weeds began to do a thing that no other tree in the whole valley was doing. They budded. While every orchard on the good bottom ground stood still and bare and cautious against the late cold, holding its blossom tight as a sensible tree does when frost is still in the country, Ada's flat-trained trees against the warm wall broke bud, and then broke bloom, a full 2 weeks ahead of anything else in 30 miles, their branches going white and pink and humming with the first bees. Pressed up against brick that never let the killing cold get its fingers on them. She would stand of a morning and look at that one wall furred with early blossom against the gray bare valley, and think of Thomas walking her along it, and feel him near. Then it was the glass frames. Down along its base, in the sunken beds she had rebedded and packed with green manure, she pulled back the puttied panes one cold April morning, expecting nothing, and found the beds warm to the hand from below, warm as a broody hen, the packed manure fermenting deep under the soil and pushing a steady bottom heat up through the earth. And in that warmth, in April, in a valley where nothing green would show for weeks yet, her lettuces and her early greens had come up thick and tender and living under the glass. She knelt over that warm bed of greens in the cold and understood the second half of the machine. The wall warmed the air over the trees from above and behind. The fermenting beds warmed the ground from below, and between the two heats, the little walled acre held its air a few degrees up off the killing point, a pocket of held spring in a valley that had not yet let go of winter. Real kitchen garden physics, worked out over centuries in the great gardens across the water, carried west in one quiet man's head, and paced out here on gravel ground the town had laughed at. Stay with me, because this is where the story stops being about a strange wall and becomes about the man who built it. And if this is bringing you some peace tonight, take a moment and subscribe so the next one finds you too. It was mending a slumped course of brick that led her to the rest. The frost heave had shoved one low stretch of the wall out of true near the north end, and she set herself to relay it, working the loose brick free one at a time to rebed them. And behind one brick, low down, where the mortar should have been the same weathered gray as all the rest, the mortar was fresh. Newer, laid smooth and pale, and not so many years old, plain against the ancient joints all around it. She stopped with the brick in her hand and looked at that patch of new mortar a long moment, and then she worked at it careful with the point of her trowel, and the brick beside it came away, and another, and behind them was not the solid heart of the wall she expected, but a small dry hollow, a chamber built into the cold end of the flue where no fire ever ran, dry and clean and sealed, and set into it, upright against the brick, was a lead-lined tin with her name scratched into the lid. Ada, just that, in his blunt, careful hand, the same clumsy letters he had scratched inside the cabin's one book and along the handle of her good spade. She did not open it. She knelt there in the cold with the tin in her two hands and the wind coming up around the corner, and she looked at her own name in his writing, and could not bring herself to open it. She had banked a whole season of hope into that wall on a dead man's word, and she was not going to read his last letter crouched in the dirt, with mortar dust on her hands and the light going. Some things you carry inside before you open them. So she wrapped the tin in a clean cloth and set it on the shelf in the house where she could see it from the stove, and she went back out and mended the slumped course true, and relaid the fresh brick over the empty chamber to his own pattern, and she left the tin unopened on the shelf, in plain sight, for later. She fed the fires that evening with a steadier hand than she had all spring. Whatever was in the tin, she had found the machine and read most of the message, and she knew now past any doubt that the Folly had never been a folly, and that a mind she had loved had been reaching for her out of the ground the whole time the valley laughed. Silas came back the last week of May, and he did not come alone. He drove out in the thick of a strange, still, over-mild afternoon, with a heavy-set man beside him on the seat, a brickyard buyer down from the next county. The two of them come to look over the wall like men pricing a slaughter beast. Ada was at the beds when they pulled up, and she straightened with her muddy hands on the small of her back and watched Silas walk the buyer along her wall, tapping the brick with a knuckle, talking figures. Fired hard, you can see it, and true courses the whole run, Silas was saying. Pull it careful, and you've got near 9,000 of the best brick in the valley, less the breakage. He had a paper folded in his coat, and he brought it out and unfolded it at her, gentle as a knife. It was a claim against the estate, he said, for the brickyard's share of what Thomas had owed him living, and it named the wall by its salvage value, and it gave the yard the right to come and take it down. He had thought it through, Silas had. If the ground was hers, he could not touch the ground, but the brick, he said, the loose salvage brick of a Folly the assessor himself had valued as nothing more, that he could claim, and he meant to have his crew out inside the week to pull it. It's for the best, Ada, he told her, not unkindly, which was the worst of it. You can't eat a wall. She heard him out. She stood before the wall her husband had built and let his brother tell her he was going to take it down brick by brick, and she felt the fear go through her cold, because a claim on paper was a thing she did not know how to fight. But she felt something else too, and it took her a moment in her fright to name it, and when she did, she went very quiet. The afternoon was wrong. It was too still and too warm and too clear, the air gone soft and dead with not a breath moving in it, the sky a hard-washed blue with no cloud to hold the day's heat down over the valley come nightfall. She had learned to watch for exactly this. Thomas had taught her to fear the mild, clear evening more than the storm, for a storm keeps a blanket of cloud over the land and holds the warmth in. But a still, clear night in the growing season lets all the day's heat rise straight up off the ground into the empty sky and pulls a killing radiation frost down out of nothing, silent, onto a valley full of open blossom. She looked at the buyer tapping her brick, and she looked at the dead clear sky, and she understood that the frost her husband had built the whole wall to beat was coming down tonight, onto a valley whose every orchard now stood in full open bloom, and that Silas meant to have this wall in a heap by week's end. You'll do as you think you must, she told them even, but you'll not lay a hand on it tonight. Come back tomorrow, if you're still of the same mind. Something in her voice made the buyer glance at the sky himself, uneasy, and Silas frowned, but they went back toward town and the hotel, because there was nothing to pull down in the dark. Ada watched the buggy grow small on the road, and then she turned to her wall and her beds, and she did not go in to her own supper at all. She fired every door that night. She had never lit them all at once, never fed them so hard, but she moved down the base of the wall in the failing light and lit each iron door and built each little fire up careful and fed it and stepped to the next and back again, the whole run of it, until the brick was breathing heat and the vents along the top smoked steady against the darkening sky. She flooded warmth into the sunken beds and banked the manure and closed the glass down tight over the greens to hold the bottom heat in. And then she settled in for the night's work, hour on hour of it, splitting kindling by feel and lantern, going door to door so the wall would drink and hold. Pip lay pressed against her leg wherever she crouched. The cold came down as she had known it would. A hard, silent, killing cold with no wind in it at all, silvering the grass beyond her fence line, creeping white across the low ground where the good orchards stood open and helpless in their bloom. But inside her fence, along her warm-breathing wall, in the little pocket of held spring she and Thomas had built between the fire above and the ferment below, the air stayed a few degrees up off the killing point, and her trees stood green and blossoming in the frostlight while she fed the fires and talked low to the dog to keep herself company through the dark. "There now," she would say, laying a stick. "There now, Pip, we're keeping it. We're keeping it yet." If you've made it this far into Ada's story, you already understand something about the people who love us and about the quiet work they leave behind. Subscribe and stay, because the wall she built was about to be judged by more than one cold night. The frost broke at dawn, and the valley woke to ruin. Ada went up on the little rise behind her house as the first gray came, stiff and soot-blacked and hollow-eyed from the night, and she looked out over the fruit valley, and it was black. Every orchard she could see, every truck field, every open acre of blossom that had stood white and hopeful the evening before, had gone brown and black and dead in the night, the whole tender crop of the valley burned off by a single silent frost. 30 miles of ruined bloom in every direction under a hard, bright, rising sun. The good bottom ground the creditors had taken lay blackened along the creek. And in the middle of all that killed country, 1 acre stood green. Her walled garden, her Folly, the thing the assessor had valued at the price of its brick, stood green and living and heavy, with set fruit already forming behind the spent blossom, the one crop left alive in the whole of the valley, breathing a last thread of wood smoke off its warm wall into the cold morning air. She stood on the rise a long while and did not, for a moment, quite believe it. Then she came down and went along her wall and put her palm to the brick, still warm, and looked at her trees, still green, and she began quietly to laugh, and then to cry, the two coming together as they will in a body past the end of its strength. And Pip pressed against her, and she knelt in the cold dirt and put her arms around the old dog and stayed there. Thomas had not built her a Folly. He had built her a wall against exactly this night, this silent, clear, killing frost that came in the growing season and took a whole valley's living, and he had known he might not be there to light the fires himself, and so he had spent the last good spring of his strength teaching her hands to do it, and he had let the whole valley laugh at her rather than frighten her while he was dying. The lighting of the fires had been a message, and she had very nearly not lit them. They came to her after that, the ones who had laughed. Word went out across the ruined valley, as such word does, of the 1 green acre, of the widow's Folly standing heavy with fruit, while every proud orchard on the good ground lay black, and by the second day they were coming up her road. Hetty Marsh first, her own cherries killed, come white-faced to see with her own eyes, and then to ask, ashamed, whether Ada might spare any scion wood off the living trees, any cutting at all. The Kessler boys came, the same ones who had ridden past hollering about warming the bricks for the dead, and they came with their hats in their hands and could not quite look at her, and asked after cuttings for their father's dead orchard. Families came who had nothing green left to feed their children in the weeks the frost had cost them, and Ada opened her warm glass frames and gave freely from the green still standing there, and cut scion wood from her living trees for any who asked, and showed them, crouching at her wall with a rusted iron door swung open. How the flues ran, and how the fires fed them, and how the beds heated from below. She sheltered the worst off among the warm beds while the cold weeks passed, and she gave and said not one word about the laughing. There was no room to say it in, and no wish to. Silas came last, near dark on the second day, and he came alone and on foot, and he stood at her gate a long time before he could bring himself through it. His buyer had gone home the morning of the frost without a brick, having seen the sky and the wall and drawn his own conclusions. Silas looked at the green acre in the middle of the black valley, and he looked at his brother's wall breathing its thread of smoke. And when he tried to speak, his voice would not hold. I was wrong about you, he got out at last, and I was wrong about him and about the wall. He said it plain, without the good coat softness, and Ada believed him. Then he told her the thing he had carried and swallowed. That claim I brought, he said. It was never right. The wall and the garden were never Thomas's debt to me, never part of the estate the creditors took nor mine to claim for salvage. He filed it separate, years back, clean, and I knew it when I came, and I came anyway, because I wanted the brick, and I told myself a mad widow would never fight the paper. My own filing proves it against me. It's yours, Ada, all of it, free and clear, and I'm ashamed to my bones. He had undone himself by his own paper, not by any force of hers, the greed tripping over its own filing. Then he went, small and dark, down the road across the ruined valley, and Ada watched from her gate with the dog against her leg until he was gone, and then she went inside and shut the door on the cold, and she took the lead-lined tin down off the shelf, and she drew a chair to the stove, and she opened it. We are almost to the end now, and the end is the reason for all of it. Stay with me. Inside the tin, on top and folded in oilcloth against the damp, was the deed and the separate filing papers, kept dry in the cold heart of the wall for years. Her own name written on them in a clerk's hand, and Thomas's beside it, the little garden and its ground made over cleanly to her, hers past any argument, and dated years before he ever took the fever. Under the deed were his drawings, careful pencil on stiff paper, the whole plan of the wall laid out, the flues and their runs and the pitch of the beds, every measure of the machine set down so it could be built again by any hand that had the paper. And under the drawings, folded twice, was a single sheet in his blunt hand, and it was to her. Ada, it read, If you are reading this, then the spring came and I did not, and I am sorrier for it than I have the words to lay down. You will have cleared the wall by now and lit the fires, or you will not have, and I have sealed this where you will only come to it if you kept the wall, because I know you, and I know you will do the thing I ask even when you cannot see the sense in it, and that is how I could go easy, for I never once doubted you would light the fires. I built the wall so the cold could never take our first fruit again, as it took it that first hard spring and near broke us. My masters built such walls in the old country, and I carried the knowing of it out here in my head, and I laid it into this brick with my own hands, so that the spring I am gone you would still have the warmest, safest ground in the whole valley, and no frost and no man could put you off it. The ground is yours, filed clean and separate, long before this. Keep the fires lit, Ada, bank the beds every spring, and light the doors on the still clear nights, and you will hold your fruit long after me, and I did not go anywhere the cold can follow. She read it through twice and folded it back along his creases and held it, and she found she did not weep as she had feared she would. It had all been for her, all of it. From that first mild evening he walked her along the wall with his flat hand on the warm brick, had been for her, sealed into the cold heart of the machine, and hidden behind the one chore he knew she would do out of love and stubbornness, even after the valley named her mad for it. He had not left her a Folly. He had left her the warmest ground in the valley and the knowing of how to keep it, and he had trusted her hands to build the thing that would save her before she ever understood it needed saving. The most that anyone had ever loved her, she understood, was laid into a wall of brick the whole valley had laughed at, and it had stood there the entire time, breathing heat into the dark, waiting for her to read it. And so she did. She wintered on that ground and springed on it and held her fruit through frost after frost, while the valley learned, slow and then, all at once, to build as she built. She taught them freely, for that was Thomas in her, and she would not hoard it. Within a few seasons the fruit valley was threaded with heated walls and glazed hotbeds run off green manure, wall after wall breathing warmth over the early bloom on the still clear nights, so that a body coming over the rise in a late frost would see a whole scatter of little gardens, each holding its own pocket of spring against the killing cold, and would never guess the fashion had started with a grieving woman folks had given up on and a wall they had priced for its brick. In the lid of the tin, under her own name in his hand, Ada took to scratching a small list with the point of a knife, just as he had scratched hers. It was the names of the ones who had come to her gate out of the black frost. Hetty Marsh, the Kessler boys, each one, the family she had fed from the frames. Silas last, she did not write them there as a ledger of who owed her, for she did not think a soul owed her a thing. She wrote them there because a garden is not the brick and it is not the trees either. A garden is the names of the people it has kept from the cold, and she meant to keep the count, and to add to it, for as long as the ground was hers. And it was hers. It had been hers all along, sitting out there worthless on the gravel at the edge of town, the one thing no one wanted, breathing heat into a killing night while the good orchards died on the good ground. The thing they laughed at was the thing that lived. The quiet man they buried without a second thought had reached up out of the brick to keep his wife's first fruit from the frost, and she had kept his fires lit, and the cold never once reached her trees. So here's the thing I would leave you with tonight, the thing Ada learned kneeling in the frost light with her bare hand on a wall that would not go cold. Sometimes the people who love us build us walls we do not understand while they still have the strength, and they trust us to keep the fires lit long after they are gone. And sometimes the thing the whole world has priced for scrap is the very thing that will carry your first fruit through the killing cold, if only you have the stubbornness to build it while they laugh. Would you have lit the fires, do you think, with the whole valley calling you mad, and the reasons sealed where you could not see them? Or would you have taken the man in the good coat's hand and let them cart the wall away for brick? Tell me in the comments, and I will read every one. Tend the fires for the people you love, and for the ones who come to your gate out of the cold. And sleep warm tonight, wherever in the world you are.